Okay, perhaps a slightly weird filming location. This is my only sort of south-facing spot, and again, sun. So gotta embrace it. I hope everybody had. Oh, actually, let me back up. I'm Sarah. Welcome back. God, I hope everybody had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I was hoping to film some Thanksgiving footage. We were on the coast of Whidbey Island, which is north of Seattle, and it uh, it's so windy and loud that there was no way I was going to be able to film there. I will probably stick in a picture of, of us reading because it was sunny. It was sunny the entire weekend. So I'm trying to catch up on what I read over the Thanksgiving break. Let me start with actually um, Catherine LeRoux's book, The Future, and I'll put an image up. And this is translated by Susan Ouriou. There's a lot of vowels and not a lot of consonants in her name, so I know I'm not pronouncing that right. So I'll spell that down below. I think I heard about this book. I can't remember if I heard about it through Kirkus or from Sarah at Eyes on Indie. But this is a dystopian novel, and it's told, I think, 4 sections. So the first section, which is really 100 pages, is Gloria's story. So Gloria is an elderly woman who moves into her daughter's house, and her daughter had been murdered, and her granddaughters are missing. So her granddaughters are like early teen, maybe, or 12, 14, something like that. And so she's moved back into Detroit to look for her granddaughters. This is a sort of alternate Detroit where Detroit sort of remained French Canadian. I'm not quite sure why that detail is in there because I'm not sure it's particularly relevant to the story. But anyway, it's this futuristic dystopian. So you have massive white flight, you have crumbling infrastructure. And so Gloria's section really sort of goes into lay out what has kind of happened here to the city of Detroit. There's no police presence, there's no medical presence, there's no real, power outages, and interestingly, there are these tours for people to come and see the urban decay. And the second section is told from the perspective of the children nearby who live in Park Rouge along the river. So the children sort of live in this community without adults. It's a little, I don't know, Peter Pan / Lord of the Flies. So they sort of have their own community. And so in part 2, you really get to see how the children are living, why they're there, orphaned. Many of them are there because of abuse, or they're orphaned because their parents died through drugs, crime, the urban ills. And sort of the response to their trauma is to live together away from adults. And so that section also is about another 100 pages. And then you get sort of the next sections where the children and the adults begin to interact, and the mystery of what happened to Judith and her granddaughters is really resolved. Sections 1 and 2 honestly felt too long. Um, they I felt like they really dragged the momentum of the story down, and there were a lot of characters, um, particularly in the kids section. There's probably 10 kids that are talked about, and of course they all have traditional or non-traditional names, so they all have nicknames. So it's, Fiji, Pow Pow, Wolf Pup, all these names. And so it was just hard to keep them all straight. Um, and there's no, and it's sort of the same thing happens in Gloria's section. A lot of the adults in the neighborhood are described, but there's no real backstories given to any of these folks. And so again, I kind of struggled to keep them all straight. Those are my complaints about this book, but I definitely have some loves to this book. One of the things that I really loved is just that sense of community. The sections with Gloria are particularly wonderful in this sense that you really, you get these scenes of all the adults, sort of meeting on the street to talk about what to do. And so it was just great to see how, as sort of the urban fabric decays, how people come together anyway to create community and to solve their own problems. So one person who was a nurse, runs the clinic in the neighborhood. One guy, starts farming essentially, has growing vegetables, and everybody in the community either, helps out growing vegetables, planting, weeding, watering, doing the things. Or, people are helping in the clinic, caring for the elderly. So, that was just a really wonderful thing to see, and there was a lot about kind of the healing of gardening, tending to plants and caring for plants and planting your seedlings and all of those things. How not only do they build community, and how growing vegetables and nourishing your neighbor can be powerful. It's also just a powerful sense of healing for that gardener. So some of those things I really, really enjoyed and appreciated. The other thing that is in here is a lot of nature's resilience. The city has fallen apart, but LeRoux puts in these scenes of plants growing through the cracks in the pavement. There's a wonderful sort of pool party scene where there's a sinkhole that happens, and I think it's part of the river that creates the sinkhole, and this sinkhole's filled with water, and the people come together and are playing in the water. So there's a lot about plants and trees and the water, everything recovering from the damage that has been done by human civilization. And so, those two things, I think, combined that feeling of community and that resilience of nature, I think actually made this a very hopeful book. Um, I always think of dystopian books as being very bleak and dark and miserable, which is usually what I gravitate to. But this one actually was very, very hopeful. That, with time, nature will recover from the damage that we've done, and will crawl out, from under civilization. And again, if we just work together and through community and through connection, we as humans can survive difficult things. Um, so, and and a little bit about how, in some ways, that community was only possible when the civilization and urban civilization was removed. You know, these neighbors didn't really know each other until, you know, the city collapsed. Um, so, you know, interesting book. Again, had some complaints, but you know, glad I ultimately read that. I also read How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. Um, this is also a dystopian book, um, that was not, you know, didn't quite fit the grim and depressing box either. I first heard about this book through David, the Poptimist's channel, and he talks about this book very soon after it was released, or soon after it was paperback. I can't quite remember, but he was definitely the first person I heard about this book from, and I bought it right away based on his review. Um, and and then of course I hadn't read it, you know, and then it was part of the book two prize. I think it made it to the semifinal round, maybe. I think so. I think it was in the final round, I think. Anyway, so you know, I finally thought, let me give it a go here. So this is linked short stories. This is in 2030. A plague is unleashed in the Arctic when a prehistoric girl is, um, you know, her mummified corpse is discovered, because there's been enough melting of the ice in the Arctic to reveal her body. And she is infected with some disease that, you know, is unleashed on humanity. Um, and in the first wave of this disease, children are dying at a very high rate. And then the virus mutates, and then now adults are being impacted. Some of these chapters are just emotionally brutal. You know, there's one where a scientist who's raising pigs for their organs. What happens when one of the pigs starts talking to him? That was heart-wrenching. And there's one with a City of Laughter. This is twisted. There's an amusement park that parents can take their sick children to. And in one of the rides, they're basically euthanized. So, again, like, sort of brutal, sort of horrific. But again, ultimately, I found this book very hopeful. That hopefulness is definitely needed to balance out some of the just gut wrenching, like, oh my God, brutal, you know. But again, it's that sense of community. It's the sense of people needing to connect with one another. And those are the people who sort of move on and move humanity forward. Yeah, I don't, there's a chapter with, like, this fake dog, you know, these robotic dogs. And, you know, this woman owns the robotic dog, and she dies, and her husband and her son, you know, bond to this dog because her voice is in it. You know, and there's just the scene of the dad overhearing his son talking to the dog saying, "Say you love me," you know, and then you hear the mom's voice, "I love you," you know, like, oh my God, brutal, right? wrenching. But again, it's really a book about community and working together and having connections to one another, and those connections are what keeps us going. Um, what I love about this too is linked short stories is um, there'll be um, a character in one story. Um, for example, she has a painting that her husband gave her, and then in other chapters, it's a chapter about the artist of that painting and the subject of that painting. So I love how almost the little Easter eggs of how these stories are connected. I personally, I find that very fun. Um, Let me jump so I read Murder on the Red River by Marcie R. Rendon. Marcie is a member of the White Earth Anishinaabe Nation, and she lives in Minnesota. And this book is the first in the Cash Black Bear series, um, also taking place um, in northern Minnesota. And Cash is also a member of the White Earth Anishinaabe Nation. I'm not a big mystery person. A friend, Jennifer, gave me this book because of my interest in reading Indigenous literature. And she's a big mystery reader, and she's always trying to lure me in to read mysteries. And this one didn't do it either. um, I think I gave this 3 stars, and this book sets up a lot of Cash's. I'm going to put the book down. Cash's story. This is in the 70s, and Cash was taken away from the reservation and put into foster care with white families throughout her childhood. And so a lot of this book is really about the trauma of that separation and losing her brothers and sisters, being separated from her mother, who and never connecting with them, and her sort of abuse in the foster care system, and the prejudice that she faced from white foster families. Um, she is helped along by the chief of police for the county, Wheaton. He found her and her mother in a car accident. Her mother drove into a ditch while intoxicated, and while her mother's spending the night in jail, Wheaton takes Cash, who is 3 at the time, and sort of cares for her that night. And he ends up sort of stepping in and and he's quite a paternal figure for her throughout this book, and has been throughout her life. There's an Indigenous man who's killed, and you've got the federal investigators coming in. Wheaton's trying to investigate, and because of Cash's Indigenous history, he asked her to help out. Go up to the Red River Reservation to question people, thinking she'll have more success than a white person. So a lot of that social commentary was very interesting. And that really fills up a big chunk of this book. It's solved by basically the murderers revealing themselves, which I found strange in a mystery. Like, I think this would be set up so, like, oh, Cash has this ability to solve crimes, or she and Wheaton partner up to solve crimes, and that's not what happens. So I thought that was sort of an interesting way to start a mystery series. I thought that was a little weird, but I don't know. Maybe that's not so weird. I don't know. But again, a lot more time was dedicated to Cash's backstory and building the community that she's in rather than solving the crime. And I think that's because it's a first book in a series. My other Indigenous related read was This Land is Their Land, the Wampanoag Indians, Plymouth Colony, and the Troubled History of Thanksgiving. I've wanted to read this on Thanksgiving for a couple of years, and I finally got around to it. This is by David J. Silverman, who is a white professor of, what is he? Native American, Colonial American, and American Racial History at George Washington University. And what he's trying to do in this book is retell the myths of Thanksgiving from a historical perspective and he's trying to demystify the early colonial period. So probably the first 100 pages are really describing the Wampanoag culture, history, the political situation in New England at the time, and the Wampanoags' history with European sailors and traders since the 1500s, and how that history and the political interactions or the political tensions between various New England tribes really shaped the Wampanoag response to the Plymouth colony. And then it sort of goes into the early Plymouth colony period, and then how, that Wampanoag English partnership disintegrates. I read about half this book. I read up to Thanksgiving, the first Thanksgiving, and a little bit of what was happening after. And I just couldn't do it. This is a very, very academic book. The history before the English even arrived. I mean, super interesting stuff, but super, super detailed. And I just feel like I need to, can I bring it up? Bring it up a level. If you want that level of detail, this is definitely, I think, a great, great book if you want that New England Indigenous history. It was just a bit too much for me. And then I wrapped it up with an audiobook, The Lie by Helen Dunmore. I've read several Helen Dunmore books, and this one definitely is on the top of my Helen Dunmore list. I remember reading her The Siege back in early 2000, 20 years ago probably. So this is probably a solid 1,000, 1,500 books ago. And I still remember scenes in that book. It's about the siege of Leningrad. And definitely if you want some dismal, booktube at war reading, this, The Siege would be fantastic. And so as a result of that, my love for that book, I've read several Helen Dunmore books. And so The Lie is my latest. This was nominated for the Walter Scott Prize as well as the Ondaatje Prize in 2015. And in fact, this book was so great. I had to go into Goodreads and see what the heck else was nominated that year and what won, because I thought this book was amazing. 5 stars. This is a World War I book. So again, another booktube at war option. You have Daniel Branwell, who is back from World War II, or excuse me, World War I, into his rural Cornwall community. He clearly has PTSD. And he is struggling with the loss of his bestie, Frederick, during the war. And there's definitely queerness to their relationship that I thought was very interesting. His romantic and sexual feelings for Frederick are never really acknowledged by himself, which was interesting. It's in some ways a very quiet novel. There's lots of scenes of him gardening, caring for the animals, walking in the countryside, which is, I think, a lot of the Goodreads criticisms of this book are that, like, lack of plot. But Dunmore's writing is just beautiful. And again, like in the future, there's just this sense of the healing power of caring for the vegetables, caring for the animals, and how critical that is for Frederick. She does a wonderful job of incorporating his PTSD into this. So, for example, maybe he's digging up weeds in the garden, and then he has a flashback to digging trenches, during the war. And so that's one of the tools that Dunmore is able to use to illustrate the history that he and Frederick had during the war. She also incorporates these quotes from, I'm guessing, sort of a field manual. Chapters open with quotes from this military manual. Like, men need to be quiet when they're on patrol, and then there'll be some scene where, Frederick and Daniel are on patrol, and anyway, so those are sort of the devices that she uses to illustrate what happened during the war. In the more contemporary storyline, he resumes his friendship with Frederick's younger sister, and I cannot remember her name, and I was searching for it. I can't find it. Anyway, I want to say it's Jenny, but it's not Jenny, because her daughter is Jeannie. But it becomes clear that she's grieving the loss of her brother, and it's clear that they both are using the connection with the other person as a way to try and maintain their connection to Frederick's memory and continue their love for Frederick. So, obviously there's a lot to do about grief in here. Again, Daniel's PTSD is a very important part of the book as well. And there are several lies in this book that slowly become revealed. So you have lies of during the war, and then how that eats at Daniel in the modern day. And in the modern day, he's sharing a cabin with Mary Pascoe, this very poor woman in the village, and she gets sick and dies, and he never tells anybody. He keeps lying that oh, she's in bed sick, but I'm caring for her. Don't come in, you know. And then he eventually is like, she's gone to see her sister in another town, right? And so that that lie eventually catches up with him at the end of the book. So so it just it is again, Helen Dunmore's writing is amazing. Um, this is one of those books where people would say, I don't like historical fiction. This is one of those books where I would say, it, this is a character study, and it just happens to be set in a historical period. Generally, a great reading week over the holiday break. My reading is going great this week, so I'm excited to share that at the end of the week. And, you know, that's what I got going on. So, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you all again in the next one. Bye.